Hey guys, tonight we delve into a world so utterly different from our own, it makes a camping trip in your backyard look like a 5-star resort. Imagine a time before smartphones, before a hot shower on demand, before most things you probably consider essential for basic comfort. We're going to wander, very, very carefully, through a hypothetical 24 hours in medieval times. Picture it. The crunch of straw underfoot, the perpetual damp chill in the air, the ever-present aroma of... well, we'll get to the aromas. Let's just say your modern sensibilities, your delicate constitution, your understandable attachment to not dying from a splinter. You probably won't survive this. It's a charming thought, isn't it? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see how far these little journeys reach. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you register is the cold. Not just a bit nippy, like you've left a window open, but a deep penetrating cold that seems to emanate from the very earth beneath you, seeping through the lumpy straw mattress you optimistically call a bed. It's a damp cold, the kind that makes your joints ache even before you've tried to move them. You're curled up, a rough, thin woolen blanket pulled up to your chin, a blanket that smells faintly of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and something vaguely animalistic. Your threadbare blanket, suspiciously damp in places you'd rather not investigate, offers about as much warmth as a stern look from your mother-in-law. Slowly, reluctantly, you peel open your eyes. It doesn't make much difference. The world is still a canvas of near-total blackness. There are no streetlights filtering through curtains here, no gentle glow from a charging phone. If you're lucky, a single shuttered window, more of an unglazed hole in the wattle and daub wall, might permit the faintest hint of pre-dawn grey. More likely, your only reference point is the dim, dying embers of last night's fire in the central hearth, a fire you desperately hope someone has the energy to rekindle soon. You lie there for a moment, listening. The silence of the deep night has given way to the subtle and not so subtle sounds of a medieval household stirring. A sniffle from your left, where your mother coughs a wet, chesty cough that seems to be her constant companion. A rustle in the straw near your feet. Could be your younger brother, could be a rat. The only smart device in this room is the rat that somehow figured out how to open the grain sack again. Further afield, through the thin walls, you hear the disgruntled grunt of a pig, the agitated clucking of chickens, and perhaps the distant, mournful lowing of a cow. This is your alarm clock, a symphony of discomfort and animal needs. Forget your 5-alarm fire drill. Your wake-up call is the urgent need to not freeze to your own straw mattress, coupled with the growing awareness of your own bodily functions. There's no bathroom down the hall, no heated toilet seat awaiting your arrival. That particular adventure is yet to come. For now, it's just the pressing reality of another day beginning in an era where survival itself is the primary occupation. You try to stretch, a small tentative movement, but your muscles protest, stiff and sore from yesterday's labour. The floor is cold, hard-packed earth. If you're slightly more affluent, you might have wooden boards, but they're still cold, still hard. And the air. Oh, the air. It's thick with the lingering smell of smoke from the fire that never quite ventilates properly, the stale scent of sleep, and the faint pervasive aroma of human waste that no amount of medieval air freshener, which by the way doesn't exist, could ever truly conquer. This period, particularly from the early 14th century onwards, saw parts of Europe, especially the North Atlantic, gripped by what climatologists call the Little Ice Age. This mainstream historical fact means your already chilly medieval morning might be significantly colder than it would have been a few centuries prior, with harsher winters and shorter growing seasons making life even more of a struggle. So this isn't just you being soft, it's objectively, historically, miserably cold. As you become more aware, you might perform a small, almost unconscious ritual. Some medieval people believed that stretching and yawning too widely upon waking could allow demons or ill spirits to enter the body through the open mouth. So, a quick, discreet sign of the cross made over your lips as you yawn is a common, almost instinctual protective gesture, a quirky little tidbit of daily superstition. Better safe than possessed before breakfast, right? The concept of time itself is a curious thing here. Historians still argue whether the average peasant truly understood the concept of time in the same minute-by-minute way we do, or if their days were governed more by natural cycles, sunrise, high noon, sunset, and the rhythm of agricultural tasks and church bells. There's no clock on the wall, no schedule to keep beyond the demands of the land, your lord, and your stomach. The sun, or rather its initial feeble promise, is your cue. You can hear more movement now. Your father is likely already up, his own hacking cough joining the morning chorus. Perhaps he's trying to coax the fire back to life, his silhouette a hunched shadow in the gloom. The thought of warmth, however smoky and inadequate, is a powerful motivator. But even that can't quite overcome the sheer, bone-deep weariness that clings to you. Every day starts like this, a battle against the cold, the damp and the darkness, a slow, reluctant climb back into consciousness and the harsh realities of your existence. Your 24 hours have barely begun, and already the comforts you take for granted are a distant, unimaginable dream. The day stretches before you, a landscape of toil and uncertainty, and it all begins here, in this cold, dark, smelly room. The pressure in your bladder, a dull ache that has been growing since before you fully woke, finally becomes insistent enough to demand action. It's a universal human need, but the medieval solution is anything but universally pleasant. You swing your legs out from under the rough blanket, your bare feet meeting the cold, unforgiving earth. For a moment, you consider the chamber pot tucked away in a corner of the one-room dwelling you share with your entire family. It's a simple earthenware pot, chipped and grim, and the thought of emptying it later is almost as unappealing as using it now. But at least it's inside. The alternative, especially if you're in a slightly more structured village or town, is the communal privy. This isn't so much a building as a designated spot, perhaps a rickety wooden structure built over a pit, or, in grander establishments like monasteries or castles, a slightly more sophisticated chute system leading to a cesspit or moat. If you're in a town, the garderobe was a common feature in castles, essentially a toilet built into the wall that emptied down the outside, often into the moat. Fun fact for castle attackers: sometimes these chutes were a weak point. You decide against the family pot, perhaps out of a fleeting sense of privacy, or maybe just because it's already perilously full from the night's contributions. So, you stumble towards the ill-fitting door, unlatching it with clumsy, cold-numbed fingers. A blast of even colder air greets you, carrying with it the complex bouquet of medieval morning, wood smoke, damp earth, animal dung, and the ever-present underlying scent of human waste that seems to cling to everything. It's not like they had Febreze back then. The best they could do was strew some herbs, which probably just made it smell like lavender-scented manure. Outside, the world is still cloaked in a murky twilight. The ground is uneven, muddy in places even if it hasn't rained recently, thanks to the general lack of drainage and the constant slop thrown from doorways. You pick your way carefully, your eyes slowly adjusting. Your destination might be a short walk, perhaps to the edge of the family plot if you're rural, or a more precarious journey down a narrow alley if you're in a budding town. Let's imagine you're heading for a communal privy. It's likely a shared facility, and privacy is a very loose concept. You might find yourself queuing, or at least exchanging groggy morning greetings with a neighbour who is similarly engaged. The structure itself is rudimentary, a plank with a hole, or perhaps two, over a pit. The smell, as you can imagine, is potent. It's a smell that permeates the wood, the earth, the very air around it. You try to breathe shallowly, you really, really try. And what about toilet paper? A quaint modern luxury. Your options are far more organic. Leaves are a popular choice, as is moss, or perhaps a handful of straw or hay, though you'd want to check that for thistles first. If you're slightly better off, you might have scraps of cloth, but these would be washed and reused, a thought that doesn't bear too much scrutiny. The Romans famously used a xylospongium or tussorium, a sponge on a stick, kept in a bucket of salt water or vinegar in communal latrines. Historians still argue whether each person had their own sponge or if it was, terrifyingly, shared. The medieval equivalent might be less formal but equally resourceful. The task complete, there's no flushing mechanism, no hand sanitizer. You might splash some water from a nearby barrel if one is available, and if the water itself isn't too suspect. but often it's just a case of readjusting your simple tunic and getting on with your day, carrying the faint miasma with you. It's amazing how quickly one can become desensitized to odours that would make a modern person faint, or maybe not amazing, maybe just necessary. Now, about that chamber pot back in the hovel. Someone has to empty it. If it's your family's, the chore often falls to the women or younger members. The contents are typically tossed into the street gutter, if such a thing exists, or onto the household dung heap, which is often conveniently located right next to the house, contributing to that unique home sweet home aroma. Garde low! Watch out for the water, was a cry you might hear in more urban settings before the contents of a chamber pot rained down from an overhead window. It's one of those quirky tidbits that sounds almost amusing until you imagine yourself on the receiving end. Pedestrian rage was probably invented shortly after the second-story window. In larger towns and cities, the accumulation of waste in cesspits beneath privies was a significant problem. This brings us to the gong-farmer, or nightman. This was the individual with the deeply unenviable job of emptying these cesspits, usually at night to minimise the olfactory offence to the general populace. A mainstream historical fact is that gong farmers, despite the unpleasantness of their trade, were often relatively well paid due to the hazardous and repulsive nature of their work. They would shovel the accumulated night soil into carts and transport it out of the town, sometimes to be used as fertiliser. It was a vital job for urban sanitation such as it was. Without them, cities would have been even more nightmarish. They were the unsung heroes of the medieval sewage system, if hero is the word you want for someone elbow-deep in centuries of human history. The concept of hygiene as we understand it, germ theory, antiseptic practices, is centuries away. People made connections between filth and disease, certainly, but the mechanisms weren't understood. So, while you might feel grubby and a bit disgusted by your morning ablutions, there isn't the same ingrained fear of germs. Still, the sheer, overwhelming presence of waste, the lack of clean water for washing, and the close proximity to it all are major contributors to why your hypothetical 24 hours are so perilous. One small cut, one unfortunate splash, and you could be introducing a host of bacteria into your system with no antibiotics to save you. So, as you step away from the privy, or turn from the emptied chamber pot, you're already carrying a microbial souvenir of your medieval morning. It's just another layer of the authentic experience. Right, so you've braved the pre-dawn chill and navigated the fragrant minefield of medieval morning necessaries. Your stomach is probably starting to rumble, a hollow ache that reminds you energy is a precious commodity, and yesterday's meagre supper is a distant memory. It's time for breakfast. But banish any thoughts of fluffy pancakes, crispy bacon, or a steaming mug of perfectly brewed coffee. The medieval breakfast, for the vast majority of the population, is a far more humble and often far less appealing affair. You shuffle back into the smoky confines of your one-room hovel. The fire in the central hearth is hopefully now crackling with a bit more enthusiasm, casting flickering shadows on the rough walls and providing a modicum of warmth. The air is still thick with smoke, as chimneys are either inefficient or, in poorer dwellings, entirely absent, with smoke finding its way out through a simple hole in the roof or the eaves. Your eyes will sting, you'll cough. This is normal. Consider it medieval aromatherapy. Very, very rustic. On a rough-hewn wooden table, or perhaps just a designated spot on the floor, the morning meal is laid out. Don't expect variety. Don't expect culinary artistry. The cornerstone of your breakfast, and indeed most meals, is bread. But this isn't the artisanal sourdough you might pick up from a fancy bakery. It's more likely to be a dense, dark loaf made from rye or barley, possibly with oats or even peas mixed in if wheat is too expensive or scarce. It's coarse, heavy, and if it's not fresh from yesterday's baking, and it often isn't, it can be incredibly hard. Stale is its default setting. Sometimes it's so hard you might need to dip it into whatever liquid is available just to make it chewable. Think less crusty baguette and more edible doorstop. Alongside the bread, you might have a pottage. This is a staple medieval dish, a thick soup or stew made from grains, oats, barley, legumes, peas, beans, and whatever vegetables are in season, and available from your small garden plot, or foraged from the surrounding area. Onions, leeks, cabbage, carrots, and turnips are common ingredients. If you're lucky, There might be a scrap of bacon or some other preserved meat flavouring the pot, but often it's entirely vegetarian, not by choice, but by necessity. This pottage has likely been simmering almost continuously on the hearth, with new ingredients added as old ones are consumed. It's the medieval equivalent of a perpetual stew, a culinary marathon that never quite crosses the finish line. And to drink? Water is an option, but as we'll discuss later, finding clean, safe drinking water is a constant challenge. For many, the breakfast beverage of choice is ale or small beer. This isn't the potent, hoppy craft brew you might be imagining. Medieval small beer was low in alcohol content, often around 1 to 2%, and was a source of calories and hydration. The brewing process, involving boiling the water, actually made it safer to drink than water from potentially contaminated sources. So, yes, you might be starting your day with alcohol, but it's more about safety and sustenance than getting a morning buzz. Children, too, would drink small beer. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of ale consumption contributed to a perpetual state of mild inebriation in medieval society, or if the low alcohol content and the sheer physical demands of daily life rendered its effects negligible. There might also be milk, if your family owns a cow or goat and it's currently lactating, but it will be unpasteurised and needs to be consumed quickly before it spoils, especially in warmer weather, which admittedly isn't your current problem in this chilly dawn. Cheese, if available, would be a hard, sharp, and likely quite pungent variety, good for grating into pottage or eating with that rock-solid bread. Sweetness is a rare luxury. Sugar as we know it is an expensive import, available mainly to the wealthy. Honey is the more common sweetener, but even that is a valuable commodity. So your breakfast is predominantly savoury, starchy and monotonous. No sugary cereals, no fruit juice, unless it's been fermented into cider. No morning pastries. It's fuel, pure and simple. A quirky tidbit for your medieval breakfast experience. Sometimes, if the bread was particularly old and riddled with weevils, those delightful little beetles that infest stored grain, bakers or households might not discard it. Instead, the weevils would simply be considered an additional source of protein. Waste not, want not, especially when want not means don't starve. So, if your bread has a little extra crunch or an unexpected nutty flavour, try not to think about it too much. Just another day in paradise, right? Eating is a communal affair gathered around the fire. Table manners are evolving. You might have a wooden bowl and a spoon, perhaps a knife that you also use for everything else from mending tools to self-defence. Forks are not yet common for everyday eating in most of Europe. You use your hands, and the bread often serves as a convenient utensil or trencher, a thick slice of stale bread used as a plate, which could then be eaten itself, given to the dogs or distributed to the poor. A mainstream historical fact is that the concept of breakfast, as a distinct named meal, wasn't universally established in the early medieval period in the way it is today. For some, especially labourers, the first meal of the day might be taken a bit later, after a few hours of work, and might be called prandium, or a similar term. The word breakfast literally means breaking the fast of the night, and its importance and timing could vary by social class, occupation, and even religious observance, as fasting was a common religious practice. So, you sit there, gnawing on your tough bread, spooning up your bland pottage, and washing it down with weak ale, the smoke stinging your eyes, the chills still in your bones. This isn't a leisurely meal. It's a functional refueling stop before the real work of the day begins. And as you consume these meagre, possibly weevil-enhanced calories, you can only hope they'll be enough to sustain you through the hours of toil that lie ahead. The day is young, and it's already demanding every ounce of your resilience. With the dubious delights of your medieval breakfast, the rock-hard bread, the perpetual pottage, the slightly safer-than-water ale, settled uneasily in your stomach, it's time to face the primary occupation of probably 90% of the medieval population, agriculture. Unless you're a noble, a high-ranking clergyman, or a specialised craftsman in a larger town, and even then, many townsfolk had garden plots, your life is inextricably tied to the land. Survival depends on what you can coax from the soil, and that coaxing requires relentless back-breaking labour. You step out of your smoky hovel, the weak morning light now a little stronger, though the air remains cold. If it's spring, you're looking at ploughing and planting. If it's summer, weeding and tending the crops. If it's autumn, the frantic race of harvest. Winter offers a slight reprieve from fieldwork, but brings its own challenges of threshing grain, mending tools, and simply surviving the cold and scarcity. For our purposes, let's imagine it's ploughing season, a time of intense effort that sets the stage for the entire year's food supply. The fields stretch out around your small village, typically organised in an open field system. This mainstream historical fact meant that the arable land was divided into large fields, which were then subdivided into narrow strips cultivated by individual peasant families. Your family has several such strips, possibly scattered across different fields, a system designed to ensure everyone got a share of both good and less fertile land. There are few fences or hedges between these strips, just furrows or marker stones. Your tools are rudimentary and heavy. The plough, if your village is fortunate enough to have one, is likely a heavy-wheeled plough, an improvement on the older, lighter scratch ploughs, but still requiring considerable effort to manage. It's pulled by a team of oxen, slow and steady, or if you're a bit better off, perhaps horses, though horses are more expensive to keep. Guiding this plough, keeping the furrows straight and deep enough, is skilled and physically demanding work. You'll be leaning your weight into it, wrestling with it over uneven ground, your muscles screaming in protest. If you're not guiding the plough, you might be the one goading the oxen, your voice hoarse from shouting commands and encouragement, and probably a few choice medieval curses that haven't quite made it into the history books. Or perhaps you're following behind, breaking up clods of earth with a heavy mallet or hoe, or scattering seed by hand from a pouch slung over your shoulder, a task that requires a careful, even rhythm to ensure good germination. There are no GPS-guided tractors here, no climate-controlled cabs. It's just you, the earth, the straining animals, and the relentless sky. The work is repetitive, monotonous, and exhausting. From shortly after sunrise until dusk, with only a short break for a meagre midday meal, if you're lucky, you're stooped, lifting, pulling, pushing. Your hands, unprotected by gloves, will be raw, blistered, and calloused. Your back will ache constantly. The sun, when it finally climbs high enough to burn through the morning chill, will beat down on you mercilessly in the summer months, or you'll be exposed to biting winds and chilling rain in the less clement seasons. Remember that little ice age we talked about? It makes the growing season shorter and the weather more unpredictable, adding another layer of anxiety to your toil. One bad harvest could mean starvation. The pace is dictated by the daylight hours and the needs of the crops and animals. There's no clocking off at 5 p.m. You work until the job is done or until you can no longer see. Your office is a muddy field, your colleagues are your equally exhausted family members and neighbours, and your performance review is whether or not you have enough food to survive the winter. It's a high-stakes game with little room for error. A quirky tidbit about medieval farming, marling. This was the practice of adding lime-rich clay or calcium carbonate, marl, to acidic soils to improve their fertility. Peasants would dig pits to extract the marl and then laboriously spread it on their fields. These marl pits, once exhausted, would often fill with water and become ponds dotting the medieval landscape. It was an ancient form of soil improvement, long before chemical fertilizers, and a testament to the ingenuity and hard labour involved in trying to make the land productive. It was also incredibly hard work, adding yet another strenuous task to the agricultural calendar. The social structure of the countryside is also evident in the fields. Most likely you're a serf, bound to the land owned by a lord, be it a knight, a baron, or a monastic order. This means you owe your lord a certain number of days of labour each week, week work, on his demesne, his personal land. In addition to farming your own strips to feed your family, you also owe him a portion of your own harvest, various feudal dues, and fees for using his mill to grind your grain or his oven to bake your bread. It's a system designed to extract surplus from your labour to support the ruling class. Historians still argue about the exact degree of autonomy versus exploitation experienced by serfs, as conditions varied significantly by region and over time. But the fundamental lack of freedom and the heavy burden of obligations are undeniable. The ever-present threat is not just exhaustion or injury, but also the weather. A drought can wither your crops in the field. Too much rain can rot them or make harvesting impossible. A hailstorm can flatten an entire year's work in minutes. There's no crop insurance, no government subsidies. You pray, you watch the sky, and you work. The sounds of the field are the creak of the plough, the grunt of the oxen, the calls of your fellow workers, the chirping of birds, perhaps looking for an easy meal of scattered seed or turned up worms, and the sigh of the wind. The smells are of freshly turned earth, animal sweat, your own unwashed body, and perhaps the distant scent of wood smoke from the village. It's an immersive sensory experience, but one born of pure, unadulterated toil. After just a few hours of this, your modern body, unaccustomed to such prolonged, intense physical exertion, would be screaming for mercy. Your 24 hours are far from over, and the most physically demanding part of your day is in full swing. Every calorie consumed at breakfast is being burned, and then some. Let's imagine, for a moment, that you're not a serf tied to the endless drudgery of the fields, or perhaps today is a day when your obligations take you, or you have a specific reason to venture, into a nearby medieval town. This isn't a pleasant stroll down a charming cobblestone lane, mind you. Navigating the streets of a medieval town is an adventure in itself, a hazardous obstacle course that would make a modern health and safety inspector break out in a cold sweat and possibly resign on the spot. As you approach the town, the first thing you might notice, apart from the defensive walls and gate if it's a town of any significance, is the increasing density of smells. Remember that charming background aroma of waste we've already encountered. Amplify it. Concentrate it. Add in the odours of various crafts and trades, the acrid smell of tanning leather, the pungent aroma of dyeing vats, the smoke from countless hearths and forges, the scent of animals being butchered in the open air, and the general, pervasive smell of unwashed humanity packed into close quarters. It's a rich tapestry of olfactory experiences, most of them unpleasant. If the town is prosperous, it might have some paved streets, at least in the main thoroughfares. But paved is a relative term. It could mean rough cobblestones, uneven and treacherous, especially when wet or icy. More commonly, especially in smaller towns or less important streets, you're looking at dirt paths, churned into a muddy morass by rain, foot traffic, cartwheels and animal hooves. There's no organised street cleaning, no sanitation department. Rubbish, food scraps, broken pottery, old clothes, animal bones, and anything else people wanted to get rid of is simply tossed out of houses and shops into the street. It's the medieval equivalent of out of sight, out of mind, except it's very much in sight and very much underfoot. Remember that delightful cry of Gardez we talked about? In a town with multi-storey buildings packed close together, the risk of an unwelcome shower from an overhead window is significantly higher. You quickly learn to walk in the middle of the street, if the street is wide enough, or to hug the walls while keeping a wary eye on the windows above. It's like a real-life game of dodgeball, only the projectiles are far less hygienic. Some towns had regulations about when and how waste could be thrown, but enforcement was patchy at best. Animals are everywhere. Dogs, cats, though their association with witchcraft sometimes made them unpopular, pigs, chickens, and even escaped livestock roam freely, foraging amongst the refuse. They add their own contributions to the general filth. The streets are, in effect, a communal dumping ground and an open-air barnyard. Imagine trying to navigate that in your simple leather turn shoes, which offer little protection against mud, muck, or whatever squishy surprise awaits your next step. You'd be longing for a sturdy pair of wellies, or possibly a hazmat suit. Drainage, if it exists at all, is usually in the form of open gutters running down the centre or sides of the street. These channels carry away rainwater, but also overflow from cesspits, slaughterhouse runoff, and all the other liquid waste the town produces. They are often choked with filth and emit their own special fragrance. Crossing these kennels, as they were sometimes called, could require a nimble leap or a resigned wade. The streets are also incredibly crowded, especially on market days. People, animals, handcarts, pack horses, and perhaps even the occasional nobleman on horseback or a heavy ox-drawn wagon are all vying for space on these narrow winding paths. There are no traffic lights, no pedestrian crossings, no sidewalks to speak of. It's a chaotic, jostling, noisy environment. Hawkers shout their wares, beggars plead for alms, children dart underfoot, and conversations are carried on at high volume to be heard above the general din. Pickpockets and cut purses thrive in such crowds, so you'd need to keep a firm hand on any valuables. Not that you, as our hypothetical time traveller, are likely to have many. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval towns, despite their squalor by modern standards, were centres of commerce, innovation, and a growing middle class of merchants and artisans. They offered opportunities not available in the feudal countryside, and their charters often granted inhabitants certain freedoms and legal rights distinct from those of serfs. This town air makes free, Stadtluft macht frei, principle was a powerful magnet for people seeking to escape the bonds of manorialism. Overhanging buildings are a common architectural feature. To maximise living space on narrow plots, upper stories often jutted out over the street below, creating jetties. While this provided some shelter from rain, or worse, it also made the streets darker, narrower, and more claustrophobic, further trapping the already stagnant air. Historians still argue whether these jetties were primarily for space, or if they also served a structural purpose in timber-framed buildings, but their impact on the urban streetscape was significant. A quirky tidbit: some medieval towns had specific regulations for certain smelly trades. Butchers, tanners and dyers, for example, might be restricted to certain areas of the town, often downwind or near a river where their waste products could be more easily, though not necessarily more hygienically, disposed of. This early form of zoning was less about aesthetics and more about trying to make the rest of the town marginally less unbearable. If you found yourself in the tanner's quarter, you'd know it by the smell long before you saw any signs. The tanning process often involved using urine or dog dung to soften hides, so you can imagine the delightful aroma. It makes that gong-farmer's job seem almost pleasant by comparison. So, as you trudge through these treacherous urban pathways, your senses are under constant assault. Your feet are wet and filthy. The air is thick with a miasma of smells that would make your eyes water. The noise is deafening, and every step is a potential hazard, from slipping in the muck to being drenched from above or having your pocket picked. It's a far cry from a pleasant city walk. This is urban life before sanitation, before planning, before personal space was really a thing, and you're right in the thick of it. Just try not to breathe too deeply. Having braved the perilous gauntlet of the town's streets, perhaps your errand, or simple, morbid curiosity, leads you to the heart of urban life, the marketplace. If the streets were a chaotic assault on the senses, the medieval market is that experience turned up to 11, a vibrant, pulsating and utterly overwhelming concentration of commerce, humanity, and yet more smells. This is where the town's economic pulse beats strongest, a riot of colour, sound and activity. Even before you see it, you'll hear it. The din is incredible. Merchants hawking their wares in loud repetitive calls. Animals, chickens clucking, pigs squealing, sheep bleating, destined for sale or slaughter. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer from a nearby stall. The chatter of hundreds of conversations. The cries of children, perhaps even the music of an itinerant minstrel trying to earn a few coins. It's a cacophony that fills the air, a human soundscape far removed from the relative quiet of the fields. Then come the smells. Oh, the smells. Overlay the general street aroma with the specific sense of everything being bought and sold. Freshly baked bread, a genuinely pleasant aroma for once. Pungent cheeses, smoked fish, live animals and their inevitable byproducts, fragrant herbs and spices, if it's a larger market catering to wealthier clientele, ripening fruit, wilting vegetables, the metallic tang of new tools, the earthy smell of pottery, the scent of wool and linen textiles, and of course, underpinning it all, the smell of the crowd itself, unwashed bodies, bad breath, and the general effluvia of a pre-sanitizer world. It's a lot to take in. You might find yourself unconsciously holding your breath, or wishing you'd brought a sprig of rosemary to sniff, like some medieval noble might. Visually, it's a kaleidoscope. Stalls are set up, often just trestle tables or blankets laid on the ground, piled high with goods. Brightly coloured textiles, if you're in a region known for dyeing, gleaming or not so gleaming metalwork, an array of foodstuffs in various states of freshness. People from all walks of life throng the marketplace. Peasants from the surrounding countryside bringing in their surplus produce or a scrawny chicken to sell, town dwellers doing their daily or weekly shopping, merchants negotiating deals, servants running errands for their wealthy masters, local officials perhaps keeping an eye on things and collecting market tolls. The concept of freshness is somewhat different here. Without refrigeration, food spoilage is a constant concern. You learn to be a discerning customer, relying on your senses, sight, smell and touch, though prodding the merchandise too much might earn you a glare from the vendor. Meat might be displayed hanging in the open air, attracting flies. Fish, unless it's freshly caught from a nearby river or pond, is often salted, smoked or dried to preserve it. Fruits and vegetables are seasonal. There are no year-round strawberries flown in from distant lands. You buy what's available, when it's available. This reliance on seasonal and local produce is a mainstream historical fact that shaped medieval diets profoundly. Prices are not fixed, haggling is expected, an art form practiced with vigour by both buyer and seller. You'd witness animated discussions, theatrical gestures, feigned outrage and eventual compromise. It's a lively dance of commerce. For you, an inexperienced time traveller trying to buy anything would be a quick way to get thoroughly fleeced. You'd be paying the tourist tax centuries before tourism was a thing. You might see specialised areas within the market. Perhaps there's a row for the butchers, another for the bakers, though sometimes bakers sold directly from their shops, a section for a fishmonger, stalls selling pottery, others with wooden tools or simple household goods. In larger towns, certain streets might be named after the predominant trade conducted there. Milk Street, Ironmonger Lane, Poultry, a lingering echo of this market-driven organisation. A quirky tidbit about medieval markets, the Buttercross, or High Cross. Many market towns had a central stone structure, often elaborately carved and sometimes covered, which served as a focal point for the market. Butter, eggs, and other dairy products were often sold here, perhaps because the stone offered a slightly cooler surface. These crosses also served as places for public announcements, proclamations, and sometimes even sermons or punishments. They were the communal notice board and speaker's corner of their day. If you saw a crowd gathered around the cross, something was definitely up. Weights and measures are another area ripe for, let's call it, creative interpretation. While towns often had official standards, particular weight or a specific length kept by the authorities, ensuring that every vendor used them accurately was a constant struggle. Tales of merchants using false-bottomed measures or doctored scales were common. Dishonest bakers, for instance, who sold underweight loaves, could face severe punishments, like being dragged through the streets on a hurdle with the offending loaf tied around their neck. It was a very public form of shaming. Historians still argue about the general level of commercial honesty versus an anything goes attitude in these markets, but the existence of such specific punishments for fraud suggests it was a significant concern. Beyond the buying and selling, the market is a social hub. It's where you catch up on news and gossip, see people from neighbouring villages, arrange meetings, or simply observe the flow of life. It's a place of opportunity but also of potential conflict. Disputes can flare up quickly, and the general crush of people can make it an edgy environment. As you wander, or are perhaps shoved through the throng, you are bombarded with stimuli. A vendor thrusts a piece of cheese under your nose, another shouts about the unparalleled quality of his woolen cloth. A stray dog sniffs at your ankles. The sheer density of human interaction, the lack of personal space, the constant negotiation for passage through the crowd. It's exhausting in a different way from field labour, but exhausting nonetheless. Your 24 hours in medieval times are proving to be a relentless test of your senses and your nerves, and you haven't even had lunch yet. Let's say, amidst the chaos of the medieval town, or perhaps back in your slightly less chaotic but equally unhygienic village, you sustain a minor injury. Maybe you stumbled on an uneven street and grazed your knee, or a tool slipped during your field labour and gave you a nasty cut. Or perhaps it's not an injury, but a persistent cough, a fever, or a toothache that's become unbearable. In the 21st century, you'd probably reach for a first aid kit, an over-the-counter remedy, or make a doctor's appointment. In medieval times, your options are far more limited, and often far more alarming. Your next stop might be the local apothecary, or if you're in a more rural setting, the village wisewoman or barber-surgeon. Forget sterile clinics and reassuringly scientific explanations. The medieval understanding of medicine is a complex blend of ancient Greek theories, primarily those of Galen, emphasizing the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, Christian dogma, folk remedies, and a healthy dose of superstition. Illness is often seen as an imbalance of these humours, or sometimes as a punishment from God, or even the result of witchcraft or malevolent spirits. If you're in a town, you might seek out an apothecary. Their shops are often fragrant with herbs, spices, and strange concoctions, but don't let the pleasant smells fool you. The apothecary is primarily a dispenser of medicinal ingredients, many of which sound bizarre or downright disgusting to modern ears. Think dried toad, woodlice, powdered stag's horn, viper's flesh, or crab's eyes, which were actually concretions from crayfish, not literal crab eyeballs, though that's hardly more appealing. These would be compounded into potions, powders, or ointments. Remember our chat about the gong-farmer? Well, human urine and animal dung were also common ingredients in some remedies, valued for their perceived warming or drawing properties. You might be prescribed a poultice of warm cow dung for that grazed knee. Delicious. Then there's the barber-surgeon. In an era where formal medical training is scarce and surgeries are brutal, often fatal last resort, barbers often double as surgeons. Their primary skill is cutting hair and shaving beards, but since they have sharp tools and a steady hand, one hopes, they also undertake minor surgical procedures: bloodletting, tooth extraction, lancing boils, and even amputations. There's no anaesthetic beyond a stiff drink of alcohol, or perhaps an opium-based draught if you're very lucky and very wealthy. Infection is an almost guaranteed complication, as germ theory is centuries away, and tools are rarely cleaned effectively between patients. A visit to the barber-surgeon is a terrifying prospect. That toothache? He'll likely yank it out with a fearsome-looking pair of pliers without anaesthetic, and you'll just have to hope he gets the right one and doesn't break your jaw in the process. Bloodletting is a particularly common treatment for a vast array of ailments. The theory is that most illnesses are caused by an excess of blood, so removing some will restore balance to the humours. This could be done by venesection, cutting a vein, often in the arm, or by using leeches. Leeches, those charming little bloodsuckers, were highly valued in medieval medicine. You might have a couple applied to your temple for a headache, or near an inflamed joint. It's a mainstream historical fact that leechcraft was a sophisticated practice, with specific types of leeches preferred for different conditions, and detailed charts showing the best points on the body for their application. Leeches were even farmed in special ponds. If you consult a university-trained physician, which is an option mostly for the wealthy in larger urban centres, you'll get a more theoretical approach. He will likely examine your urine. Uroscopy was a key diagnostic tool with elaborate charts depicting different colours and sediments and their supposed meanings. Take your pulse and ask about your diet and lifestyle. His prescriptions might involve complex herbal remedies, dietary changes, perhaps avoiding cold foods like cucumbers if you have too much phlegm, and, almost inevitably, bloodletting. Historians still argue about the efficacy of university-trained physicians versus the more practical hands-on approach of barber-surgeons or folk healers for common ailments, given that much of the learned medicine was based on flawed ancient theories. A quirky tidbit: the doctrine of signatures. This was a belief that God had marked plants and other natural substances to indicate their medicinal uses. For example, a plant with heart-shaped leaves might be used for heart conditions, or a plant with yellow flowers, like celandine, for jaundice, which causes yellowing of the skin. Walnuts, resembling brains, were thought to be good for head ailments. It's a form of sympathetic magic woven into herbalism, a charmingly simplistic but utterly unscientific approach to pharmacology. So if your apothecary hands you something that looks suspiciously like the ailment you're suffering from, don't be surprised. What about that grazed knee? If you're lucky, it might be cleaned with wine, which has some antiseptic properties due to the alcohol, or vinegar. It might be dressed with a poultice of herbs known for their healing properties, like comfrey or yarrow. Cobwebs were sometimes used to staunch bleeding, which, while sounding unsanitary, might have inadvertently introduced some antibiotic mould compounds. However, infection is the great enemy. Without antibiotics, even as to sea, small wound can turn septic, leading to fever, amputation, or death. Your chances of surviving a serious infection are slim, so as you sit there, perhaps with a leech happily draining your excess blood, or contemplating a poultice made of ingredients you'd rather not identify, you're at the mercy of medieval medical understanding. The practitioners are generally doing their best with the knowledge they have, but that knowledge is often a dangerous mix of the ineffective and the actively harmful. It's a stark reminder of how vulnerable people were to illness and injury, and why a simple cut could indeed mean you wouldn't last 24 hours, or at least not many more beyond that. The phrase, adding insult to injury, probably originated with someone being prescribed a dung poultice for a paper cut. While you're contemplating the dubious medical care, or perhaps just trying to get through your day of toil or town navigation, another fundamental need presses: hydration. We've touched on the weak ale at breakfast, but what about water? Surely good old H2O is readily available. Not so fast. Securing genuinely safe drinkable water in medieval times is a daily, often arduous and sometimes disgusting chore fraught with its own set of perils. This isn't as simple as turning on a tap. If you live in a rural village, your primary water sources are likely to be wells, springs or rivers and streams. A well, if your village has one, is a significant asset. It needs to be dug deep enough to reach a reliable water table, and ideally lined with stone to prevent collapse. Drawing water is done by hand with a bucket and rope, or perhaps a simple windlass mechanism if the well is more sophisticated. This is physically demanding work, often falling to the women and children of the household, and there's no guarantee of purity. Surface runoff, animal waste and seepage from nearby latrines or dung heaps can easily contaminate a shallow well. Remember that privy pit we discussed? If it's too close to the well, you're basically drinking diluted sewage. Yum! Springs can be a cleaner source, especially if they emerge from high ground, away from immediate sources of pollution. However, access might be limited, or the spring might be some distance from your dwelling, requiring a long, tiring trek carrying heavy water containers, often earthenware jugs or wooden buckets. Rivers and streams are convenient, especially for larger settlements that often grow up along their banks. But rivers are also the medieval equivalent of a multi-purpose utility corridor. They're used for drinking water certainly, but also for washing clothes, with rudimentary soaps made from animal fat and lye, which themselves pollute the water. Watering livestock, who then defecate directly into it. Dumping waste from trades like dyeing and tanning, remember those delightful tanner's chemicals, and as a convenient disposal route for general refuse and sewage. So the further downstream you are, the more enriched your water supply becomes. It's a cocktail of everything the upstream communities have decided to discard. In towns, the problem is magnified. Higher population density means more waste and greater demand on limited water sources. Some towns had public wells, but these were often overused and prone to contamination. Wealthier households might have their own private wells in their courtyards, offering a slightly better, but still not guaranteed, quality of water. Roman-era aqueducts, which had once supplied some European cities with clean water, had largely fallen into disrepair during the early medieval period. While some efforts were made to maintain or rebuild them, or to construct new conduits, often open channels or lead pipes, the latter bringing its own risk of lead poisoning, these were expensive undertakings, usually benefiting only the wealthiest districts or monastic establishments. A mainstream historical fact is that monasteries, with their emphasis on hygiene, relative to the general populace, and their engineering capabilities, often had some of the most sophisticated water management systems of the period, including piped water for hand washing and latrines. This scarcity and dubious quality of water is precisely why ale and wine were such common daily drinks for many. The brewing process, involving boiling the water, killed many harmful microorganisms, making fermented beverages a safer bet, even for children, in the form of small beer. However, constantly relying on ale isn't ideal, and plain water is still needed for cooking, some washing, and for those who couldn't afford or didn't have access to enough ale. Think about the effort involved. Multiple trips per day, often over considerable distances carrying heavy containers. In winter, wells and streams could freeze, making access even more difficult. In summer, droughts could reduce water sources to a trickle, leading to shortages and increased competition. Water rights, who had access to which source, could be a source of dispute between individuals, villages, or even a village and its lord. A quirky tidbit, the water diviner, or dowser. While not exclusively medieval, the practice of dowsing, using a forked stick or pendulum to locate underground water sources, was certainly known. Some people were believed to have a special gift for finding water this way. Whether it was genuine intuition, keen observation of landscape and vegetation, or just luck, a successful water diviner could be a valuable asset to a community looking to dig a new well. It's a practice that sits at the intersection of folk belief and practical necessity. Historians still argue about the extent to which medieval people were aware of the link between contaminated water and disease. While they lacked germ theory, empirical observation likely taught them that water from certain sources was more likely to cause illness. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera, and other waterborne diseases were rampant. They might not have known why, but they might have known which well in the village was the bad well, or that water drawn upstream was generally better. They developed rudimentary filtering methods, like letting water stand so sediment could settle, or pouring it through layers of sand or cloth, but these were of limited effectiveness against dissolved contaminants and microscopic pathogens. So, every time you take a sip of water in your hypothetical medieval day, you're playing a kind of Russian roulette with your digestive system. Is this the sip that leads to days of debilitating diarrhea, a potentially fatal illness in an era without rehydration salts or effective medical care? The simple act of quenching your thirst, something we do without a second thought, is laden with risk and effort. Your water bottle, with its filtered, readily available contents, is a miracle of modern technology by comparison. Back here you lift the heavy bucket, hoping the contents are more life-giving than life-threatening, and you really, really hope that what you just scooped up isn't directly downstream from where your neighbour just mucked out his pigsty. The taste might give you a clue, but by then, it's often too late. The sun, having climbed laboriously through the morning sky, now hovers somewhere around its zenith. Whether you've been toiling in the fields, navigating the treacherous streets of a town, or perhaps haggling in the marketplace, your body is signalling the need for a pause and more fuel. It's time for the midday meal. But if your breakfast was a grim affair, don't expect a significant culinary upgrade for lunch. For most medieval people, this is another functional, often meagre, repast designed more for sustenance than pleasure. If you're a peasant working in the fields, your lunch break is likely taken right there, amidst the dirt and the crops. You might find a patch of shade under a tree if one is conveniently located, or simply sit on the ground. There's no designated lunchroom, no comfortable chairs. Your meal is something portable, carried with you from the hovel in a cloth bag or a simple wooden container. What's on the menu? More bread, almost certainly. That same dense, dark and likely stale loaf from breakfast makes a reappearance. It's the medieval carbohydrate cornerstone. Alongside it, you might have a hunk of cheese, again probably a hard, sharp variety that travels well. An onion, eaten raw like an apple, provides a pungent crunch and some vitamins. Perhaps a leek or a carrot if they're in season, and you had one to spare from the garden. If you're particularly fortunate, there might be a piece of dried or salted meat, or a hard-boiled egg. But for many it's a largely vegetarian affair, dictated by what's cheap and available. Pottage, that ever-present stew, might make an appearance if you're working close enough to home to fetch some, or if someone brings it out to the field workers. But more often the midday meal in the field is cold and dry. Imagine trying to get that hard bread down with a dry throat, especially if your water supply for the day is limited or unappetizing. It's a far cry from a leisurely picnic. To drink, it's likely more of that small beer or ale you had at breakfast, carried in a water skin or a wooden flask. Or, if you're relying on water, it's whatever you managed to draw from the well or stream that morning, hoping it's not too flavourful. In a town setting, if you're an artisan or labourer, you might have a similar packed meal, or you could purchase something from a street vendor. Cooked food sellers, or cook shops, were a feature of medieval towns catering to travellers, poorer townsfolk without their own cooking facilities, or those who simply wanted a quick hot meal. Here you might find meat pies, of occasionally dubious filling. Mystery meat was definitely a medieval concept. Pasties, roasted, meats, if you could afford them, or bowls of pottage or soup. Hygiene standards in these cookshops were, shall we say, variable. It was a gamble. You might get a decent filling meal, or you might get a raging case of food poisoning. Always check for a good crowd. A popular stall was usually a safer bet, the medieval equivalent of online reviews, a mainstream historical fact. For the nobility and wealthy merchants, the main meal of the day was often dinner, taken sometime between late morning and mid-afternoon. The exact timing varied and shifted over centuries. This could be an elaborate multi-course affair, featuring a variety of roasted meats, rich sauces, expensive spices, and fine wines. For the common person, however, the midday meal was simpler and often called nuns or noonings, reflecting its timing around the nuns, the 9th hour after sunrise, which was one of the canonical hours of prayer. The word lunch as a term for a light midday meal came into common usage much later. A quirky tidbit about medieval eating habits: the void. After a substantial meal, especially in wealthier households, there would sometimes be a final light course called the void or issue. This often consisted of wafers, candied spices, believed to aid digestion, fruit and wine intended to clear the table and settle the stomach. For our peasant in the field, the void is more likely the empty space in their stomach that the meagre meal didn't quite fill. Perhaps they can look forward to a nice, refreshing void of disappointment after their dry bread and onion. Historians still argue about the nutritional adequacy of the average medieval peasant diet. While it was often monotonous and heavily reliant on grains, it wasn't necessarily always deficient, especially if they had access to a decent garden plot for vegetables and legumes, and perhaps some foraged foods. However, it was precarious. A bad harvest, a harsh winter, or the loss of a crucial animal like a milk cow could quickly tip a family into malnutrition and starvation. The hunger gap, the period in late spring before the new crops were ready, when last year's stores were running low, was a particularly dangerous time, so you sit there, quickly consuming your midday morsels. There's no lingering over coffee, no leisurely chat. The break is short, the demands of the day are pressing. The sun is high, and there are still hours of work ahead before you can think about returning home. This meal is purely functional, a pit stop to refuel the body for the afternoon's labour. It's probably not very satisfying, possibly not very safe if it came from a questionable cook shop, and certainly not very exciting. As you chew your tough bread and raw onion, you might glance at your fellow workers, their faces grimy and streaked with sweat, their expressions stoic. There's a shared understanding of the hardship, a quiet camaraderie born of common toil. But there's little energy for conversation beyond what's necessary. Every calorie counts. This brief pause, this unappetizing refuel, is just another checkpoint in your 24-hour medieval endurance test. It offers little comfort, little respite, just the bare minimum to keep you going. And as you swallow the last gritty mouthful, the fields, the workshop, or the perilous town streets are already calling you back. The afternoon stretches before you, promising more of the same. As your day progresses, whether you're toiling in the sun-baked fields or navigating the crowded, fragrant streets of a medieval town, you might, if you're particularly unlucky, or perhaps just in the wrong place at the wrong time, bear witness to another stark reality of this era: the swift and often brutal administration of justice. Forget lengthy trials, appeals processes, and forensic science. Medieval law and order, while often rooted in complex legal codes and traditions, could manifest in public displays that were both a form of entertainment and a chilling deterrent. Imagine you're in the town marketplace, perhaps having just finished your meagre midday meal. Suddenly a commotion erupts. A cry of "Stop thief!" goes up. The crowd parts, and you see a figure darting through the stalls, pursued by an angry merchant and a couple of burly town guards or watchmen. If caught, the thief's fate could be decided remarkably quickly. Justice in medieval times was often very public and very physical. The aim was not just to punish the offender, but also to make an example of them, reinforcing social order and discouraging others from similar transgressions. For petty crimes like minor theft, the punishments could include public humiliation. The culprit might be put in the stocks or a pillory. The stocks were wooden frames with holes for the ankles, and sometimes the wrists, forcing the offender to sit in an uncomfortable, exposed position. The pillory was similar but held the head and hands, forcing the person to stand. Passers-by were often encouraged to jeer, taunt, and even throw rotten fruit, mud, or animal dung at the unfortunate individual. It was a profoundly shaming experience, and in a society where reputation was paramount, this could be a severe punishment in itself. For more serious, but still not capital, offences, flogging was common. The condemned would be stripped to the waist and whipped publicly, often while being paraded through the streets. Branding with a hot iron, marking the offender for life, was another possibility for crimes like vagrancy or repeated thievery. Mutilation, such as the cutting off of a hand for theft or an ear for perjury, also served as a permanent visible warning. These weren't scenes from a fantasy novel, they were grim realities. If the crime was deemed capital, murder, treason, heresy, arson, or sometimes even grand larceny, the punishment was, of course, death. And medieval executions were designed to be as gruesome and terrifying as possible. Hanging was common, often carried out at a prominent gallows located at the edge of town or near a major crossroads, ensuring maximum visibility. The bodies might be left hanging for days or weeks as a stark warning, slowly decomposing and picked up by crows. It's a far cry from a quiet, dignified end. Beheading, usually by sword or axe, was considered a more honourable death, and was often reserved for those of noble birth. Burning at the stake was the prescribed punishment for heresy and witchcraft, a particularly agonising way to die. For particularly heinous crimes like treason, the sentence could be hanging, drawing and quartering, a truly horrific process involving being hanged until almost dead, then disemboweled while still alive, and finally having one's body cut into 4 pieces, which might then be displayed in different parts of the kingdom. The medieval judicial system wasn't shy about making a statement. It's a mainstream historical fact that such brutal punishments were common across Europe, and were seen as necessary to maintain order in a society with limited policing capabilities. You might also witness a trial by ordeal, particularly in the earlier medieval period, though its use declined over time, especially after the Church officially condemned it in 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council. Ordeals were a way of appealing to God for judgment when human justice was uncertain. Common ordeals included carrying a red-hot iron bar for a set distance, or retrieving a stone from a cauldron of boiling water. The accused's wound would be bandaged, and if it healed cleanly within a few days, they were deemed innocent. If it festered, they were guilty. Trial by combat was another form, where accuser and accused, or their champions, would fight, the victor believed to be favoured by God. Historians still argue about how often these ordeals were genuinely believed to reveal divine will versus being manipulated to achieve a desired outcome. A quirky tidbit: animal trials. Yes, you read that right. Medieval records show instances of animals, pigs, dogs, cattle, even insects like weevils, being formally tried in court for alleged crimes, such as a pig killing a child or locusts devastating crops. They might be provided with a lawyer of sorts, and if found guilty could be sentenced to death or excommunication. This practice seems utterly bizarre to us, but it reflects a worldview where the lines between the human, natural and supernatural realms were more blurred, and where all of creation was seen as subject to God's law. Imagine the court stenographer trying to get an accurate testimony from a sow. Does the pig oink yes or no to the charge of aggravated assault with a snout? So, as you stand in the medieval crowd, perhaps witnessing a thief being dragged to the pillory, or hearing the pronouncement of a harsh sentence, you get a visceral understanding of how power and authority are maintained. There's little room for ambiguity, and mercy can be a rare commodity. The spectacle is designed to instill fear and obedience. The screams of the punished, the jeers of the crowd, the solemn pronouncements of the judge or magistrate. It's a raw, unsettling display. This isn't just background noise to your day, it's a fundamental aspect of the medieval world. The threat of such justice, or injustice, depending on your perspective and social standing, hangs over everyone. It's another layer of anxiety in an already challenging existence, and as you turn away from the scene, perhaps feeling a mixture of fear, pity, or even a grim satisfaction if you felt the punishment was deserved, you're reminded that survival here isn't just about food and shelter, but also about navigating a complex and often unforgiving social and legal landscape. One wrong step, one accusation, and you could be the one in the stocks, or worse. As you move through your medieval day, whether in the fields, the town, or your own humble dwelling, you're never truly alone. And I don't just mean the human population. You are constantly surrounded by, and in close proximity to, a vast array of creatures, domestic animals, vermin and insects, whose presence is an unavoidable and often uncomfortable fact of life. Forget your modern notions of sterile environments and pest control. In medieval times, the animal kingdom is an intimate and often invasive part of your daily existence. If you're a peasant, your most valuable companions are your livestock: oxen for ploughing, a cow for milk, if you're lucky enough to own one, perhaps a few sheep for wool and milk, pigs for meat, and chickens for eggs and the occasional pot. These animals are not kept in distant, sanitized barns far from the house. More often than not, they live in very close quarters with the family. In many peasant hovels, especially in colder regions or during harsh weather, animals might be brought inside the single-room dwelling at night for their protection and for their body heat, which would help warm the human inhabitants. So you might find yourself sleeping a few feet away from a grunting pig or a cud-chewing cow. The sounds, smells, and yes, the fleas and lice they carry are all part of the shared living experience. It's a far cry from a pampered house pet. These are working animals vital to your survival, but their proximity brings a host of sanitation challenges. Pigs in particular were ubiquitous in both rural and urban settings. They were efficient foragers, often allowed to roam freely, consuming refuse and scraps, including, as we've unpleasantly noted, human waste. This made them a valuable source of meat, but also a potential hazard, as they could be aggressive, and their rooting and defecating contributed to the general squalor of streets and yards. Remember those animal trials? Pigs were frequent defendants, often for injuring or killing young children. Dogs and cats occupy a more ambiguous space. Dogs were valued for hunting, herding and guarding property. Different breeds existed for different purposes, from large mastiff types, for protection, to smaller terriers for ratting. Cats, while useful for controlling vermin, had a more complicated reputation. Their association with witchcraft and pagan practices, particularly black cats, sometimes led to their persecution, especially during periods of heightened religious fervour. However, many households still kept them for their mousing abilities. A good mouser was worth its weight in, well, not eaten grain. And speaking of vermin, they are your constant unwelcome roommates. Rats and mice are everywhere, in the thatched roofs, in the walls, in the grain stores, under the beds. They thrive in the unsanitary conditions, feasting on stored food and refuse. They are not just a nuisance, they are a serious threat to your food supply and carriers of disease. The fleas they harbour are notorious for transmitting illnesses like the bubonic plague. A mainstream historical fact is that the Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the mid-14th century, was spread by fleas carried on black rats that travelled along trade routes. This pandemic wiped out an estimated 30 to 60% of Europe's population, a catastrophic event with profound social and economic consequences. Your efforts to protect your food stores from these pests are relentless, but often futile. Grain might be stored in earthenware pots, wooden chests, or hung from the rafters in sacks, but determined rodents often find a way in. You might have a cat, or a terrier, or set rudimentary traps, but it's an ongoing battle you rarely win decisively. You just learn to live with a certain amount of loss, and perhaps, like with the weevils in your bread, you try not to think too hard about what else might have nibbled on your food before you did. Then there are the insects. Oh, the glorious, swarming, biting, itching insects. Flies are abundant, attracted by the omnipresent waste, food scraps and livestock. They buzz around your food, land on your face, and generally make a nuisance of themselves. Mosquitoes breed in any standing water, and in an era without window screens they have free access to you, especially at night. Their bites are itchy, and they too can transmit diseases. And then there are the more personal pests, lice and fleas. These are an accepted part of life for most people. Regular bathing is a luxury, and clothing is often worn for extended periods without washing. We'll get to your Scratchy wardrobe soon. This creates a perfect habitat for body lice and fleas. You scratch. Everyone scratches. Delousing by picking them off by hand, or using fine-toothed combs, often made of bone or wood, is a common grooming activity, sometimes a social one. Remember those romantic depictions of medieval ladies having their hair elaborately dressed? Part of that process might well have involved a thorough delousing. A quirky tidbit: flea fur. Some wealthy ladies in the later medieval period wore small animal furs, like marten or sable, called flea furs or zibellini, draped over their shoulders or held in their hands. The idea was that fleas would be attracted to the warmth of the fur rather than the lady herself. Whether this was effective or just a fashionable way to acknowledge an unavoidable problem is debatable, but it's a rather charmingly direct approach to pest management. Imagine a modern celebrity walking the red carpet with a flea fur. It would certainly be a conversation starter. Bedbugs are another delightful companion, infesting straw mattresses and wooden bed frames, emerging at night to feed on unsuspecting sleepers. You wake up with itchy welts, another small misery to add to your collection. Historians still argue about the overall impact of these constant creature discomforts on medieval people's psyche and health beyond the obvious disease vectors. Did the constant itching, the awareness of vermin, the proximity to animal filth contribute to a general sense of unease or fatalism, or did people simply become inured to it as a normal part of existence? It's hard to say, but it certainly paints a picture of a life lived in much closer, and often less pleasant, contact with the animal world than most of us experience today. So as you go about your day, swatting at flies, feeling the occasional suspicious itch, hearing the rustle of unseen creatures in the walls, you are starkly reminded that this world is shared. There are no pesticides, no exterminators on call, no hermetically sealed homes. The boundary between the human and animal realm is porous, almost non-existent. These creatures are not just a minor annoyance, they are a constant presence impacting your food, your health, and your comfort. Just another charming feature of your 24-hour medieval experience. Try not to let the bedbugs bite too much. Now, let's talk about what you're wearing as you navigate this challenging medieval world. Swatting at flies and hoping your lunch wasn't pre-nibbled by rats. Your wardrobe is not going to win any fashion awards by modern standards, nor is it designed for comfort or convenience. Medieval clothing for the common person is primarily functional, durable, and frankly, probably quite uncomfortable and not particularly clean. The primary fabric for most of your garments is wool. Sheep were a vital part of the medieval economy, and wool was a versatile material, warm, reasonably water-resistant when lanolin-rich and durable. However, medieval wool processing was not as refined as today. The wool could be coarse, scratchy, and heavy. Imagine wearing a thick, slightly greasy and decidedly itchy sweater, not just as an outer layer, but as your main clothing, directly against your skin. That's the starting point. Your basic undergarment, if you're a man, is a linen shirt or smock called a chemise, or camisa, reaching to the knees or mid-thigh. Women wear a similar, longer linen shift or chemise, often down to the ankles. Linen, made from the flax plant, is softer than wool and more absorbent, so it provides a bit of a barrier between your skin and the scratchy woolen outer layers. It's also easier to wash than wool. Easier being a relative term, as laundry is a laborious, infrequent chore involving harsh lye soap, much scrubbing, and often washing in cold river water. So, while your linen undergarments might be washed more frequently than your outer woolens, frequently could still mean only once a week, or less often if water or time is scarce. You probably own very few of these, perhaps two, one to wear while the other is eventually being washed. Over this linen layer, men typically wear woolen hose, stockings, that cover the legs, sometimes reaching up to the waist and tied to a belt or a drawstring on their breeches or brays. Brays are loose linen under trousers. On top of the chemise, a man would wear a tunic, also usually made of wool, varying in length from mid-thigh to below the knees, depending on fashion, status, and occupation. It might be belted at the waist. For warmth or protection, an outer tunic, cloak or mantle also of wool could be added. Women wear their long linen chemise, and over that one or more woolen gowns or kirtles. These are typically long, fairly fitted at the bodice, and fuller in the skirt. Sleeves could be long and tight, or sometimes wider. Layers are key for warmth. A woman might also wear a woolen cloak or mantle for outdoors. Head coverings are essential for adult women, a sign of modesty and marital status. This could be a simple linen veil, a wimple covering the head, neck and chin, or a more structured headdress depending on regional fashion and social standing. Going about bareheaded if you were a married woman was generally not done. Colour is an indicator of wealth. Dyes are expensive, especially vibrant, lasting colours. The poorest people wear undyed wool, which is off-white, grey or brown. Russet was a common coarse, reddish-brown homespun cloth. Vegetable dyes from plants like woad blue, madder red and weld yellow can produce a range of colours, but they might be muted or fade easily. Bright rich colours like crimson from Kermes insects, or deep purple from murex snails, though mostly in antiquity and for the very elite, are signs of extreme wealth and status. So your wardrobe is likely a symphony of earthy tones, not the vibrant hues often depicted in romanticised medieval paintings, which often portray the nobility. Footwear, as we've touched upon, is basic. Leather turn shoes are common. These are simple shoes made by sewing the upper to the sole inside out, and then turning them right side out. They are relatively soft and flexible, but offer little protection from mud, water, or sharp objects. You might stuff them with straw or moss for a bit of extra insulation or cushioning. Wooden pattens, overshoes with raised wooden soles, might be worn outdoors to elevate your leather shoes above the muck of the streets, but these would be clumsy to walk in. Going barefoot, especially for children or the very poor in warmer weather, is also common. A mainstream historical fact: sumptuary laws. These were laws enacted by authorities to regulate what people of different social classes could wear, including the types of fabrics, colours and embellishments. The idea was to maintain the visible distinctions between social orders and prevent commoners from dressing above their station. For example, certain furs like ermine or sable, or specific expensive fabrics like silk or cloth of gold, might be reserved for the nobility or royalty. While often difficult to enforce perfectly, these laws underscore the importance of clothing as a marker of social identity. Clothing is also incredibly valuable. Fabric is produced by hand, shearing sheep, carding and spinning wool, weaving cloth on a loom, all incredibly labour-intensive processes. A new garment is a significant investment. Clothes are worn until they literally fall apart. They are patched, mended, turned inside out, and handed down. Wills from the period often list individual garments as valuable bequests. You don't have a closet full of outfits. You have a few essential items that you wear day in, day out. A quirky tidbit: dagging. In the later medieval period, particularly the 14th and 15th centuries, a fashion emerged for dagging, cutting the edges of garments, like tunic hems, sleeve edges or hoods, into ornamental scallops, points or leaf shapes. It was a way to add a bit of decorative flair even to relatively simple clothes. However, some moralists condemned dagging as a sign of vanity and extravagance, associating it with worldly decadence. So, if your tunic hem is fashionably jagged, you might be seen as trendy by some and a sinner by others. Fashion police have always been around, it seems. And cleanliness? We've mentioned it, but it bears repeating. Without easy access to hot water, effective soaps for delicate fabrics lie as harsh on wool, or frequent changes of clothes, personal hygiene is a challenge, and your clothes inevitably reflect that. They will smell of wood smoke, sweat, food, and the general environment. Lice and fleas, as we know, are common. Imagine wearing the same heavy, scratchy, slightly damp and odorous woolen garments for days or even weeks, especially in winter. It's not a recipe for comfort. Historians still argue about the actual frequency of bathing and laundering among different classes, with some evidence suggesting that public bathhouses were more common in some urban areas than previously thought. But for the average peasant, a full bath was likely an infrequent event. So your medieval attire is less about style and more about survival and social signalling. It's heavy, probably itchy, rarely truly clean, and you don't have many changes. It's just another layer of the medieval experience that reminds you how different life was, right down to the clothes on your back. And as you scratch an itch under that coarse wool, you might long for the softest, simplest cotton t-shirt from your own time. Amidst the daily grind of survival, the toil, the questionable food, the ever-present grime, there is one institution whose influence permeates every aspect of medieval life: the church. Its bells mark the passage of your day, its teachings shape your world view, and its authority touches everyone from the lowest peasant to the highest king. You cannot escape its presence. It is woven into the very fabric of society. From the moment you wake, possibly to the sound of the Angelus bell calling the faithful to prayer, the church makes its presence felt. Throughout the day, the canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nuns, vespers, and compline, would be rung from the village church or local monastery. While you, as a common labourer, wouldn't necessarily attend all these services, many were primarily for clergy and monastic orders. The bells serve as a constant auditory reminder of God's presence and the rhythm of religious observance. They are the medieval equivalent of a public clock, dividing the day into segments devoted, at least notionally, to sacred duty. Your local parish church is likely the most substantial building in your village, probably the only one made of stone. It's the centre of community life, not just for religious services, but also for social gatherings, local announcements, and sometimes even as a place of refuge or storage. Inside, it might be relatively plain if you're in a poor rural parish, or more elaborately decorated with wall paintings, murals depicting biblical scenes, saints, or terrifying images of heaven and hell. The doom paintings over the chancel arch were a common feature. Stained glass, if the parish could afford it, and a carved wooden rood screen separating the nave, where the congregation stood or sat on rough benches if at all, from the chancel, the holier area around the altar. These visual aids were crucial for a largely illiterate population, serving as a Bible for the poor. Sunday is, of course, the most important day. Attendance at Mass is expected, often compulsory. It's a chance to wear your slightly less filthy clothes, to gather with your community, and to receive spiritual instruction and often social instruction on how to be a good, obedient peasant or townsperson. The service is conducted in Latin, a language you likely don't understand by a priest whose own level of education and piety can vary considerably. You follow the rituals, the gestures, the familiar sounds, understanding the gist through repetition and the visual cues around you. The sermon, if delivered in the vernacular, your local language, is where you'd get more direct moral and doctrinal guidance. The church calendar dictates much of your year. Feast days, celebrating various saints or events in Christ's life, are numerous. Some are major holidays involving feasting, if you can afford it, and a welcome break from work, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and various saints' days specific to your region or patron saint. There are also fast days, particularly during Lent, the 40 days before Easter, and Advent, the period before Christmas, as well as on Fridays, when abstaining from meat is required. These religious observances provide a structure to the year, a cycle of feasting and fasting, celebration and penance. A mainstream historical fact is the sheer number of holy days, holidays, in the medieval calendar, which, while providing breaks from labour, also meant that the actual number of working days in a year could be significantly less than in the modern era, though the work on those days was often more intense. The sacraments mark the key stages of your life. Baptism shortly after birth, crucial, as unbaptized infants were believed to be denied entry to heaven. Confirmation, marriage, confession and penance, regularly, and especially before receiving communion at Easter, and last rites, extreme unction, at the point of death. The church is there from cradle to grave, guiding and judging. Tithing is another significant aspect of the church's presence. You're required to give 1/10 of your produce, grain, livestock, vegetables, to support the local priest and the wider church. This can be a heavy burden, especially in lean years, but non-payment can lead to severe spiritual and sometimes temporal penalties. Beyond the formal structures, popular piety is vibrant and diverse. Veneration of saints is hugely important. Saints are seen as intercessors with God, and particular saints are patrons of specific professions, ailments, or situations. You might pray to Saint Anthony if you've lost something, or St. Roch if you fear the plague. Relics, the physical remains of saints or objects associated with them, are believed to possess miraculous powers, and pilgrimage to shrines housing important relics is a common act of devotion, a way to seek healing, forgiveness, or divine favour. These pilgrimages, like the famous one to Santiago de Compostela in Spain or to Canterbury in England, could be long and arduous journeys. A quirky tidbit: church ales. These were parish fundraising events, essentially parties or feasts held in the churchyard or a church house, where specially brewed strong ale was sold. The profits went towards church maintenance or charitable causes. They were a way for the community to socialise, celebrate and support their local church, though sometimes they could get a bit rowdy, leading to criticism from more puritanical elements within the church who felt such festivities were unseemly. Imagine a bake sale, but with significantly more alcohol and possibly some Morris dancing. Historians still argue about the depth and nature of genuine religious belief among the common medieval populace. Was it deeply internalised faith, or more a matter of social conformity and fear of damnation? Evidence suggests a wide spectrum, from profound personal piety to a more pragmatic, even superstitious, engagement with religious practices. What is undeniable is the church's pervasive power, not just spiritual but also economic. It was a major landowner, and political. Bishops and abbots were often powerful feudal lords, and the Pope could challenge kings. So, as the church bells toll, calling you to prayer or simply marking another hour past, you are reminded of a power greater than your feudal lord, a framework of belief that explains your world, your suffering, and your hopes for an afterlife. Whether a source of comfort, a burden of obligation, or a bit of both, the church is an inescapable part of your 24 hours, shaping your thoughts, your actions, and the very rhythm of your medieval life. After what feels like an eternity of toil, perhaps broken by the midday meal and the ever-present clang of church bells, there might come a time, if you're lucky, for a sliver of leisure. But banish any thoughts of Netflix binges, scrolling through social media, or a relaxing hobby like model shipbuilding. Medieval recreation, especially for the common folk, is often rough, ready, and sometimes downright risky. It's less about quiet unwinding and more about letting off steam, often in ways that reflect the harshness and physicality of daily life. For the peasant in the countryside, true leisure time is scarce, especially during peak agricultural seasons like planting or harvesting. The demands of the land are relentless. However, Sundays, after Mass of course, and the numerous religious feast days and holidays scattered throughout the year do provide opportunities for a break from work. These are occasions for communal gathering, feasting, if resources allow, and various forms of entertainment. What does medieval fun look like? Well, it's often active and competitive. Wrestling is a hugely popular pastime, a test of strength and skill practiced by men and boys in village greens or any open space. Foot races, archery contests, especially in England, where the longbow is a vital military tool and practice is encouraged, and games involving throwing heavy stones or logs are common. These activities not only provide entertainment, but also hone physical prowess, which has practical applications in a world where strength and agility can mean the difference between a full belly and an empty one, or survival in a skirmish. Ball games are also prevalent, though they bear little resemblance to modern organised sports. A form of medieval football, often called mob football or shrovetide football, is a chaotic, often violent affair. Entire villages or parishes might compete against each other, with vaguely defined goals, perhaps a particular tree or a church door miles apart, and very few rules. The ball could be an inflated pig's bladder. These games can involve hundreds of players, ranging over vast areas, and result in numerous injuries, broken bones, and general mayhem. It's less the beautiful game, and more a barely controlled riot with a ball. Authorities sometimes try to ban these games due to their disruptive and dangerous nature, but their popularity often endures. Dancing is another common form of recreation, especially at festivals and celebrations. Accompanied by simple instruments like pipes, drums or fiddles, if a musician is available, villagers would engage in lively folk dances. These are communal activities, a chance for men and women to socialise, flirt and enjoy a sense of shared merriment. The carol, a ring dance often accompanied by singing, is particularly widespread. Hunting, while a primary source of food and a prestigious activity for the nobility, who have exclusive rights to hunt deer and boar in vast forest preserves, is mostly off-limits for peasants. Poaching game from the Lord's forest is a serious offence, often met with harsh punishments. However, peasants might be allowed to hunt smaller game like rabbits or birds on common land, or set snares and traps. This is less sport and more a supplement to their diet. In towns, recreational opportunities might be slightly more diverse, though often still boisterous. Taverns and alehouses are central to social life, places to drink, gamble. Dice games are hugely popular and often lead to quarrels, tell stories, and catch up on gossip. These establishments are not always savoury, often associated with drunkenness, brawling, and other less than pious activities, much to the chagrin of church authorities. A mainstream historical fact, miracle plays and mystery plays. These were theatrical performances, often organised by town guilds or the church, depicting biblical stories, the lives of saints, or allegorical tales of vice and virtue. Initially performed inside churches, they later moved to public squares and marketplaces, often on elaborate wheeled stages or pageant wagons. These plays are a major form of popular entertainment and religious education, full of drama, humour, even slapstick, and vivid depictions of heaven, hell, and the human condition. They are the medieval equivalent of blockbuster movies, drawing large crowds. A quirky tidbit, cockfighting, and bear baiting. These are examples of the more brutal blood sports that are popular forms of entertainment across social classes. In cockfighting, specially bred roosters, often fitted with metal spurs, are made to fight each other to the death, with spectators betting on the outcome. Bear baiting involves chaining a bear to a post and setting dogs upon it. Bull baiting is similar. These spectacles are considered thrilling entertainment, a reflection of a society far less sentimental about animal suffering than our own. It's hard to imagine, but these would be family outings for some. The sound of a cheering crowd as animals tear each other apart is a jarring contrast to the quiet hum of your fan. Historians still argue about the precise function of these often violent or chaotic pastimes. Were they simply a reflection of a brutal age, a necessary outlet for aggression in a rigidly hierarchical society? Or did they also serve to reinforce community bonds and social norms, albeit in a rough-and-tumble way? Whatever the interpretation, it's clear that medieval leisure is not for the faint of heart. Even children's games often mimic adult activities or involve a degree of risk. Mock jousts, playing with toy weapons, rough-and-tumble games, these all prepare children for the realities of adult life. Simpler pastimes include spinning tops, playing with knuckle bones, animal ankle bones used like dice, or simple dolls and toy animals for younger children. So, if you do get a moment of respite in your 24-hour medieval ordeal, your fun is likely to be loud, energetic, probably a bit dangerous, and very public. There's little concept of private, quiet leisure. It's about community, competition, and a release from the drudgery of work. And as you watch, or participate in, a boisterous game of mob football, or tap your foot to a lively peasant dance, you get a glimpse into how medieval people blew off steam. Just try not to get trampled, or inadvertently join the losing side of a drunken tavern brawl. Your health insurance definitely doesn't cover injuries sustained during Shrovetide football. Perhaps your day involves a journey, not a commute on a climate-controlled train, or a quick drive down a paved highway, but a genuine medieval trek from one place to another. Even a seemingly short trip, say, to the next village to visit relatives, or to a slightly more distant market town to sell a few surplus eggs, is an undertaking fraught with uncertainty and potential peril. The concept of a safe and easy journey is an anachronism here. First, consider the roads themselves. We've already touched on the state of town streets. Muddy, rutted and littered with refuse. Rural roads are often no better, and frequently much worse. Major routes, some of which might follow the lines of old Roman roads, might receive some rudimentary upkeep, perhaps through a lord's obligation or a monastic order's efforts. But for the most part, roads are little more than dirt tracks, worn down by centuries of foot traffic, animal hooves and cartwheels. After rain, they can become impassable quagmires, sucking at your feet or the wheels of a cart. In dry weather, they can be dusty and bone-jarringly uneven. There are no helpful road signs giving distances or directions, no GPS to guide your way. You rely on local knowledge, landmarks, a distinctive tree, a distant church spire, the lie of the land, or by following a river or an established track. Getting lost is a real possibility, especially if you're travelling through unfamiliar territory, or if bad weather obscures visibility. If you're travelling on foot, which is the most common mode for ordinary people, your pace is slow and laborious. A good day's walk might cover 15 to 20 miles, depending on the terrain, the weather, and your physical condition. Remember those uncomfortable leather turn shoes. They're not exactly designed for long-distance hiking. Your feet will be sore, blistered, and aching. If you have goods to transport or are slightly better off, you might use a pack horse or a donkey. Carts, usually simple two-wheeled affairs pulled by oxen or horses, are used for heavier loads, but their progress is slow, and they are particularly vulnerable to getting bogged down on bad roads. The wealthy, of course, travel on horseback, a much faster and more comfortable option, often accompanied by a retinue of servants and guards. One of the primary concerns on any journey is safety. The roads are not policed. Wooded areas, lonely stretches of track and mountain passes are notorious haunts for bandits and outlaws. These are not romantic figures like Robin Hood, though tales of such benevolent outlaws certainly existed. They are desperate men, often former soldiers or dispossessed peasants, who will rob, beat, or even kill travellers for a few coins or a meagre bundle of goods. A mainstream historical fact is that maintaining order and safety on the king's highways was a constant challenge for medieval rulers, and various measures, like the Statute of Winchester in England, 1285, which required lords to clear land alongside major roads to reduce ambush spots, were enacted to try and combat this threat. Travelling alone is particularly dangerous. People tend to travel in groups for mutual protection, or attach themselves to larger parties such as merchants' caravans or groups of pilgrims. Even then, an encounter with a determined band of robbers can be a terrifying and life-threatening experience. You carry any valuables you have with extreme caution, perhaps hidden in your clothing, and hope you don't look like a tempting target. Bridges are another choke point and potential hazard. Many rivers have to be forded, which can be dangerous if the water is high or the current strong. Bridges, where they exist, are often narrow, rickety wooden structures, or more substantial stone ones that might require a toll to cross. The toll is used for the bridge's upkeep, or sometimes it's just a source of revenue for the local lord who controls it. Refusing or being unable to pay the toll could lead to trouble. Accommodation on the road is also a concern. If your journey lasts more than a day, you need to find somewhere to spend the night. Monasteries traditionally offer hospitality to travellers, providing simple food and shelter, though they might prioritise pilgrims or those with letters of introduction. Inns and alehouses are found along major routes and in towns, but their quality varies enormously. Some are reputable establishments, others are rough, dirty, and potentially dangerous places, frequented by unsavoury characters. You might find yourself sharing a room, or even a bed, with complete strangers. If no formal lodging is available, you might seek shelter in a peasant's hovel, perhaps offering a small payment or some goods in return, or simply sleep rough by the side of the road or in a barn, exposed to the elements and potential threats. A quirky tidbit: sanctuary. Churches and certain other consecrated grounds offer a degree of legal protection known as the right of sanctuary. A fugitive from justice, or someone fearing for their life from pursuers, who reached a sanctuary site could claim immunity from arrest for a certain period, often 40 days. During this time they were supposed to be safe, though they might have to negotiate their surrender, confess their crime, or agree to go into exile, abjure the realm. This practice highlights the Church's significant legal and social power, sometimes putting it at odds with secular authorities. So if you're being chased by bandits, ducking into the nearest churchyard might be your best bet, assuming you can make it. Historians still argue about the actual volume of travel in the medieval period. While it was certainly more difficult and dangerous than today, people did travel for trade, pilgrimage, to find work, to attend markets or fairs, or to escape famine or war. The idea of a completely static, immobile peasant population is an oversimplification. However, for most, any journey beyond their immediate locality is a significant undertaking, not to be entered into lightly. So, as you trudge along a muddy track, your shoes soaked, your muscles aching, casting nervous glances into the dense woods lining the road, you appreciate just how large and intimidating the world can feel. Every unfamiliar sound, every approaching stranger is a potential threat. The simple act of getting from A to B is an adventure in itself, a test of endurance and courage. And you can only hope that your destination is worth the perils of the journey, and that you arrive with your skin and your meagre possessions intact. As dusk begins to settle, casting long shadows and painting the sky in hues of grey and faded orange, your long, arduous medieval day is finally winding down. Whether you've spent it toiling in the fields, navigating the chaotic town, or perhaps even enduring a perilous journey, the thought of shelter, however humble, becomes paramount. But don't envision a cosy cottage with charming roses around the door. Your medieval home is likely to offer little more than basic protection from the elements, and even that is often a generous assessment. It's a hovel, not a home in the modern sense, and its comforts are few and far between. If you're a peasant, your dwelling is probably a 1 or 2 room structure, small, dark and crudely built. The walls are typically made of wattle and daub, a framework of woven wooden strips, or wattle, daubed with a sticky mixture of clay, dung and straw, or rough timber, perhaps with a low stone foundation if you're in a rocky area. These materials offer minimal insulation against the cold of winter or the heat of summer. Gaps and cracks are plentiful, allowing draughts, damp and unwelcome creepy crawlies to enter freely. Remember those creature discomforts. Your home is their home too. The roof is likely thatched with straw, reeds or heather. Thatch can provide decent insulation and waterproofing if well maintained, but it's also highly flammable, a constant worry, especially with open hearths inside, and a favourite nesting place for rodents and insects. Leaks are common, leading to damp patches on the earthen floor below and a general feeling of clamminess. Windows, if they exist at all, are small openings, unglazed, and covered with wooden shutters or perhaps translucent animal horn, thinly scraped and oiled, or greased linen cloth to let in a little murky light, while keeping out some of the wind and rain. Glass is an expensive luxury reserved for churches and the homes of the very wealthy. This means the interior of your hovel is perpetually dim, even during the day. The floor is most commonly packed earth. It's cold, damp, uneven, and impossible to keep truly clean. In slightly better off peasant homes, or in some town dwellings, you might find wooden, plank floors, but these too are rough and draughty. Rushes, straw or herbs might be strewn on the floor to provide a bit of insulation, absorb spills and try to mask odours, but these quickly become soiled and need to be periodically swept out and replaced, a task that probably doesn't happen nearly often enough. Imagine the layers of accumulated filth under those rushes. It's best not to. The centrepiece of your single living space is the open hearth, usually located in the middle of the room or against one wall. This is your source of heat for warmth and cooking. However, as we've noted, chimneys are inefficient or non-existent in poorer dwellings. Smoke from the fire fills the room, stinging your eyes, coating the walls and roof timbers with soot, and contributing to chronic respiratory problems. You learn to live with the constant smell of wood smoke clinging to your clothes, your hair, and everything you own. It's the signature scent of medieval domesticity. Furniture is minimal and crudely made. A rough-hewn wooden table, a few simple stools or benches, perhaps a wooden chest to store your few valuable possessions, like your extra set of equally scratchy clothes. Beds, as we'll discuss more when it's time to actually sleep, are rudimentary. There are no comfortable sofas, no bookshelves lined with pleasant reads, no decorative knickknacks. Every item is functional, born of necessity. Privacy is a non-existent concept. Your entire family, parents, children, perhaps even an elderly grandparent, lives, eats, and sleeps in this one shared space. If you brought animals inside for the night, they're part of the cosy throng too. Personal space is a luxury you can't afford. Every cough, every sniffle, every nocturnal rustling is shared. A mainstream historical fact. The structure of medieval peasant houses varied significantly by region and over time. For example, the longhouse was common in some parts of northern Europe, a rectangular building that housed both the family and their livestock under one long roof, with a partition separating the human living quarters from the animal byre. This arrangement, while perhaps aromatically challenging, allowed the animal's body heat to help warm the human dwelling. If you're a town dweller, your home might be part of a timber-framed building, possibly with an upper story that jetties out over the street. Space is at a premium in towns, so dwellings are often narrow and deep, and built very close to their neighbours, while a prosperous merchant might have a more substantial house with multiple rooms, glazed windows, and perhaps even tiled floors or tapestries on the walls. The urban poor often live in conditions just as squalid, if not more so, than their rural counterparts, crammed into rented rooms or tenements. Fire is an even greater hazard in densely packed towns, with timber buildings and thatched roofs creating a tinderbox environment. Major urban fires are a recurrent disaster. A quirky tidbit: witch marks, or apotropaic marks. These are symbols or carvings sometimes found on the timbers, fireplaces or doorways of medieval and early modern houses. They were intended to ward off evil spirits, witches, or bad luck. Common marks include daisy wheels, hexafoils, intertwined V's, for Virgo Virginum, the Virgin Mary, or burn marks made with candles. It's a form of folk magic, a superstitious attempt to protect the home and its inhabitants from unseen malevolent forces. So, if you see some strange graffiti on your doorpost, it might not be medieval vandalism, but your ancestors' version of a home security system. Historians still argue about the psychological impact of living in such close, often unsanitary and uncomfortable conditions. Did it foster a stronger sense of family and community cohesion out of shared hardship, or did it lead to increased friction and a blunted sensitivity to personal discomfort? Perhaps a bit of both. What's clear is that your medieval shelter offers little respite from the harshness of the outside world. It's a place to huddle against the worst of the weather, to cook your meagre meals, and to snatch a few hours of uneasy sleep. But it's far from a sanctuary of comfort and peace. As night truly falls, and the only light in your hovel comes from the flickering embers of the dying fire or a single sputtering tallow candle, made from animal fat and giving off a smoky, unpleasant smell. The shadows lengthen, and the small space feels even more confined. The sounds of the night, the wind whistling through the cracks, the rustle of unseen creatures, the snores and coughs of your family, close in around you. This is your refuge, such as it is, at the end of your 24-hour medieval day. And you're not even in bed yet. The last vestiges of daylight have long since vanished, and the deep, impenetrable blackness of a medieval night has descended. Inside your smoky, cramped hovel, the fire on the central hearth has been banked for the night, carefully covered with ashes to keep the embers alive until morning, conserving precious fuel. Any other light source, like a flickering tallow candle or a rushlight, a piece of dried rush pith dipped in animal fat, is used sparingly as both are valuable. It's time for the evening meal, supper, but don't expect a feast to cap off your challenging day. This meal is likely to be as sparse and unexciting as your breakfast and midday repast. Gathered around the dim glow of the dying fire, your family prepares to eat. The table might be the same rough-hewn plank you used earlier, or perhaps you simply sit on stools or the floor holding your wooden bowl or trencher. The atmosphere is subdued, tinged with the weariness of a long day's labour. What's on the menu for this final meal of the day? There's very likely to be pottage again. Yes, that same perpetual stew we met at breakfast, still simmering away, perhaps with a few more odds and ends thrown in during the day. A handful of foraged greens, a stray root vegetable, maybe, if you were incredibly lucky, a tiny scrap of leftover meat or bacon to add a whisper of flavour. It's warm at least, which is a comfort in the encroaching chill of the night, and it's filling in a starchy, monotonous way. Alongside the pottage there will of course be bread, that trusty, dense, dark loaf, perhaps now even harder than it was at midday. You might dip it into your pottage to soften it, or gnaw on it determinedly. If the day was particularly lean, or if grain stores are running low, especially during that dreaded hunger gap before the new harvest, the bread itself might be the main, or even the only, component of your supper. Fresh dairy, like milk, is unlikely to be part of the evening meal unless consumed immediately after milking, as it spoils quickly without refrigeration. Cheese, however, being preserved, might make another appearance, perhaps a small piece to be eaten with your bread. Foraged foods could supplement the meal if the season is right, and someone had the time and opportunity to gather them. Mushrooms, hopefully the non-poisonous kind, a risky game of medieval roulette. Nuts, berries, or wild greens. These would add a welcome bit of variety and nutrition, but their availability is inconsistent. A mainstream historical fact, the timing and composition of meals varied by social class and season. While the nobility might enjoy a late leisurely supper, often with multiple dishes and wine for the working population, the evening meal was typically simpler and eaten earlier, especially in winter when daylight hours were short and artificial light was costly. The main concern was getting enough calories to fuel the next day's labour and to stave off hunger during the night. What about leftovers? In a world where food is precious and scarcity is a constant threat, very little goes to waste. Any scraps not fit for human consumption would be fed to the pigs or dogs, if you have them. Bones might be boiled repeatedly to extract every last bit of marrow and flavour for the pottage pot. Waste not, want not, is the fundamental rule of the medieval kitchen. Conversation around the meal is likely to be sparse. Tiredness hangs heavy in the air, perhaps a brief recounting of the day's events, a word of instruction for the children, or a muttered prayer of thanks for the food, however meagre. The near darkness doesn't lend itself to animated discussion. The focus is on the practical act of eating, of replenishing spent energy. A quirky tidbit: sops. This refers to pieces of bread that were dipped into wine, ale, or other liquids, like the broth from pottage. It was a common way to consume bread, especially if it was stale and hard. The word supper itself is thought by some etymologists to derive from the Old French super, meaning to sup, or to take a light evening meal, often involving soup or sops. So your act of dunking that unyielding crust into your pottage is carrying on a long culinary tradition. You're not just eating, you're participating in linguistic history. How exciting! As you eat your scanty supper in the dim, smoky hovel, you're acutely aware of the sounds of the night outside. The wind, perhaps the distant howl of a wolf if you were in a wilder area, the chirping of crickets. Inside, the sounds are more intimate. The crackle of the dying embers, the breathing and chewing of your family members, the occasional rustle in the thatch that reminds you of your rodent roommates. Historians still argue about the specific nutritional deficiencies common in peasant diets and their long-term health consequences. While scurvy, vitamin C deficiency, was certainly known, and conditions like rickets, vitamin D deficiency, likely occurred, the sheer resilience of people who survived on such monotonous and often limited fare is remarkable. However, this diet also left them vulnerable to illness and less able to recover from injury or periods of intense hardship. There's no dessert, no after-dinner coffee or tea, Once the bowls are scraped clean, perhaps literally licked clean, or wiped with a final piece of bread, the meal is over. The washing up is minimal, a quick rinse of the wooden bowls and spoons with a bit of precious water, if that. This evening meal is not a moment of relaxation and indulgence. It's a final, functional act before succumbing to the exhaustion of the day. It's a reminder of the constant struggle for sustenance, the precariousness of your food supply, and the sheer simplicity, and often hardship, of daily existence. As you finish your share of the pottage and bread, the only thing left to look forward to is the questionable comfort of your bed, and the hope that you'll have the strength to face whatever the next day brings. The medieval night has only just begun, and it holds its own set of challenges. The last crumb of supper has been consumed, the meagre remnants cleared away. The fire is a dull red glow in the centre of your hovel, offering little light and even less warmth against the encroaching night chill. Outside, the world is plunged into a profound darkness, a blackness almost unimaginable to a modern city dweller accustomed to the perpetual twilight of streetlights and glowing screens. This is the medieval night, and it is a time when anxieties sharpen and unseen threats feel much closer. With no effective public lighting in villages or even most parts of towns, save for perhaps a lantern hung outside a wealthy merchant's house or an inn, once the sun goes down, visibility drops to near zero. If there's a moon, its pale light might offer some orientation, but on a cloudy or moonless night, moving around outside is a treacherous undertaking. You risk tripping over unseen obstacles, falling into ditches or those open sewers in town, or simply getting lost even in familiar surroundings. This darkness is not just an inconvenience, it's a breeding ground for fear. Folk tales and superstitions populate the night with all manner of malevolent entities. Ghosts, demons, mischievous sprites, and of course, witches believed to be active under the cloak of darkness. The rustling in the trees, the hoot of an owl, the creak of a floorboard, every unexplained sound can take on a sinister meaning in the Stygian gloom. Your imagination, already primed by a worldview steeped in the supernatural, can easily run wild. Remember those apotropaic witch marks on the door? They're there for a reason. People genuinely feared what the night might hold. Beyond the supernatural, the darkness offers perfect cover for more tangible threats. Crime rates often increase after nightfall. Thieves, burglars and footpads can operate with greater impunity. If you live in a town, the Night Watch, often a motley crew of conscripted citizens armed with lanterns and staves, might patrol the main streets, calling out the hours and theoretically offering some measure of security. However, their effectiveness is debatable, and they can't be everywhere at once. Dark alleys and unlit side streets remain perilous. Lock your doors and bar your shutters is not just a quaint saying, it's essential advice for surviving the night. Your simple wooden door, perhaps secured with a wooden bar or a basic latch, feels like a flimsy barrier against whatever or whoever might be lurking outside. Even inside your hovel, the darkness is not entirely benign. The risk of accidental fire from a stray ember or an overturned candle is ever present, and a fire at night when everyone is asleep can quickly become a catastrophe, especially in a dwelling made of wood and thatch. The sounds of the night are different from those of the day. The hustle and bustle of human activity subsides, replaced by the sounds of nature if you're rural. Crickets, owls, the distant bark of a fox, perhaps the unsettling howl of a wolf pack if you live near a forest. In town, you might hear the occasional drunken shout, the footsteps of the watch, or the scuttling of rats, which become bolder in the absence of humans. These sounds, unfiltered by the background hum of modern life, are more distinct, more immediate, and sometimes more unnerving. A mainstream historical fact, curfews were common in many medieval towns and cities. The word curfew itself comes from the Old French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire. At a set time in the evening, often signalled by a church bell, residents were required to extinguish or cover their household fires to reduce the risk of conflagrations. The curfew bell also often signalled the time to be off the streets, helping authorities maintain order and making it easier to identify anyone moving about suspiciously after hours. What do people do during these long, dark hours before sleep? If it's winter, the nights are especially long. Artificial light from tallow candles or rushlights is smoky, smelly, and expensive in terms of fuel or materials, so it's used sparingly. Extended work like mending tools, spinning wool, or sewing might be done by the dim light of the fire if absolutely necessary, but often Once darkness falls and the evening meal is done, there's little to do but prepare for sleep. Storytelling might occur, with family members sharing folk tales, legends, or recounting events, but even this is often done in near darkness, relying on voice and memory. A quirky tidbit: the necessary woman, or necessary man. In larger, wealthier households or castles, this was the servant whose job included tending to the chamber pots and close stools, especially during the night. Imagine having to navigate dark, draughty corridors in a castle, carrying full chamber pots without tripping or spilling. It's another one of those wonderfully unglamorous but essential medieval occupations. For your peasant family, of course, the chamber pot is likely in the corner of your one-room hovel, making nighttime calls of nature a slightly less perilous, but no less fragrant affair. Or you might brave the cold and dark to use the outdoor privy, a truly courageous act. Historians still argue about how medieval people perceived and experienced darkness. Was it simply an accepted part of life, something they were accustomed to from birth? Or did the lack of artificial light and the prevalent superstitions create a pervasive, low-level anxiety every evening? It's likely a combination. While familiarity might have bred a certain level of acceptance, the folklore and the very real dangers associated with darkness suggest it was never a truly comfortable time. The night is also a time when aches and pains and the general discomforts of your medieval existence might feel more acute. The cold seeps in, your hard bed offers little solace, and the minor ailments you've ignored during the day make themselves known. The silence, broken only by unsettling creaks or the snores of your family, can amplify worries about the harvest, about debt, about the health of a sick child. So as you sit in the deepening gloom, the day's labour heavy in your bones, the medieval night enfolds you. It's a time of vulnerability, of heightened senses, of waiting. It's a reminder that even within the supposed safety of your own walls, the world remains a challenging and often intimidating place. Your 24 hours are drawing to a close, but the final hurdle, actually getting some restful sleep, is still to come, and in the medieval world even that is no simple matter. The time has finally come, after a day that has tested your endurance in countless ways. From the pre-dawn chill to the unsettling darkness of night, the only thing left is to seek the oblivion of sleep. But if you're dreaming of a comfortable mattress, fresh linens, and a quiet, temperature-controlled room, you are, once again, in for a rude awakening, or rather, a rude bedding down. Sleep in medieval times, for most people, offers little escape from the general discomfort of their existence. It's often just a different flavour of unpleasantness, this time involving a lumpy, flea-infested palate. Where do you sleep? If you're a peasant, it's likely on the same earthen or rough wooden floor of your one-room hovel, where you ate your meals and spent your waking hours. Perhaps there's a slightly raised area, or a designated sleeping corner. The concept of a separate bedroom is a luxury for the affluent. Your entire family sleeps together in this communal space, adding to the chorus of snores, coughs, and rustlings. Remember those animals you might have brought in for warmth and safety? They're part of the slumber party too, contributing their own unique sounds, smells, and of course, their share of insects. Your bed itself is rudimentary. You might have a straw-filled pallet, essentially a sack made of coarse cloth stuffed with straw or dried bracken. This is laid directly on the floor. Over time, the straw compacts, gets damp, and becomes a haven for all sorts of delightful creatures. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, and perhaps even the occasional rodent will be your unwelcome bedfellows. The straw needs to be changed periodically, but periodically might not be nearly often enough. The very idea of bedbugs takes on a whole new, very literal meaning here. Sweet dreams are probably not on the menu. If you're slightly better off, you might have a simple wooden bed frame, perhaps with ropes or leather straps stretched across it to support the straw pallet or a feather mattress, a true luxury. But even this offers limited comfort and doesn't eliminate the pest problem. Sheets, if you have them, are likely coarse linen, infrequently washed. Blankets are heavy woolen things, probably, the same ones you huddled under to ward off the initial morning chill, still carrying the day's accumulation of smoke, sweat, and indeterminate medieval aromas. Pillows? Perhaps a log, a bundle of rags, or just your arm tucked under your head. Specialised pillows are not a standard item for the commoner. You make do with what's available. Preparing for bed is a simple affair. There's no elaborate nighttime routine, no brushing of teeth with minty toothpaste. Dental hygiene often involves rubbing teeth with a rough cloth, perhaps with some abrasive powder like crushed sage or salt, if anything at all. You likely sleep in your linen chemise or under tunic, the same garment you've been wearing all day under your woolen outer clothes, removing your outer layers, your shoes, if you wore them indoors, and perhaps your belt is the extent of your disrobing. There are no cosy pyjamas here. The atmosphere in your sleeping space is far from conducive to restful slumber. The air is still thick with the lingering smoke from the hearth. The floor is cold and damp. The sounds of your family members snoring, muttering in their sleep, a child crying out, are a constant backdrop. And then there's the itching. The relentless, maddening itch from flea bites, lice and bedbugs. You scratch. You turn. You try to find a comfortable position on your lumpy, unyielding bed. But true, deep sleep can be elusive. A mainstream historical fact, segmented sleep, or biphasic sleep. Historical records and literary sources suggest that it was common in the pre-industrial era for people to have two distinct periods of sleep per night, separated by a period of wakefulness. This first sleep and second sleep pattern meant people might wake up for an hour or two in the middle of the night. During this interval, they might pray, meditate, attend to a child, have a quiet conversation, or even engage in intimate relations. The idea of a single, uninterrupted 8-hour block of sleep as the norm is a relatively modern concept, possibly linked to the advent of artificial lighting extending the waking day. Privacy, even for marital intimacy, is almost non-existent in a crowded one-room peasant dwelling. Any such activities would have to be conducted with extreme discretion, under the cover of darkness and amidst the sleeping forms of children and other family members. It's a far cry from a romantic private bedroom. A quirky tidbit, nightcaps. While often associated with later periods, simple head coverings were worn to bed by both men and women in medieval times as well. These weren't just for fashion, they helped to keep the head warm, important in drafty, unheated sleeping spaces, and also to protect against lice and other hair-dwelling pests. So that charming image of someone in a pointy nightcap. It had a very practical, if slightly unglamorous purpose. It was less about looking cute and more about not having your scalp colonized. As you lie there, trying to drift off, your mind might replay the day's events, or anxiously anticipate the morrow's toil. The physical discomfort of your bed, the itching, the cold, the strange noises from outside the thin walls, all conspire against peaceful rest. Sleep is less a gentle surrender and more a temporary uneasy truce with consciousness. Historians still argue about the quality and duration of sleep experienced by medieval people. While the segmented sleep pattern might suggest a different rhythm, the constant physical labour and lack of modern stressors might, for some, have led to easier sleep despite the uncomfortable conditions. However, the prevalence of pests, the lack of true comfort, and the anxieties of daily life undoubtedly took their toll. Your 24 hours in medieval times are culminating in this final, uncomfortable ritual. You've endured the cold, the filth, the hunger, the toil, and the fear. Now you just have to survive the night on a bed that feels more like a penance than a refuge. As you scratch one last flea bite and pull the rough woolen blanket tighter, you close your eyes, hoping for a few hours of oblivion before the cycle begins anew. That is, if dawn breaks for you. The long, uncomfortable night wears on. You drift in and out of a shallow, fitful sleep, punctuated by itches, the snores of your family, the rustle of unseen creatures in the straw beneath you, and the persistent chill that seems to bypass your thin woolen blanket entirely. Each time you surface to a groggy awareness, it's still dark, still cold. The only way you know time is passing is by the subtle shifts in the sounds from outside, or perhaps the changing position of the moon, if its light happens to penetrate a crack in the shuttered window. There's no glowing clock face to reassure you that dawn is approaching. There is only the waiting, and the underlying unspoken question that hangs in the air of every medieval dwelling each night. Will everyone see the morning? This is not a melodramatic thought. It's a stark reality of life in this era. The constant threat of illness, accident, or even violence means that each night is a gamble. Waking up is not taken for granted. A cough that started as a minor annoyance yesterday could worsen overnight into something far more serious. A fever could spike. That small, untreated wound from a slipped tool could, by morning, be showing the angry red signs of a spreading infection. infant and child mortality rates are devastatingly high. Many children do not survive their first few years, succumbing to diseases that are now easily preventable or treatable. Dysentery, measles, smallpox, or even a common cold that develops into pneumonia. As a parent, you would lie awake listening to every breath your child takes, a knot of anxiety in your stomach. Every sniffle, every whimper in the night could be the precursor to tragedy. A mainstream historical fact is that it was common for families to have many children, not just out of a desire for a large family, but because it was understood that not all of them would survive to adulthood. This harsh reality shaped family structures and emotional attachments in ways that are difficult for us to fully comprehend. For adults too, life is precarious. There are no antibiotics to fight infections, no advanced surgical techniques for injuries, no widespread understanding of sanitation to prevent the spread of disease. A sudden illness, like the sweating sickness that appeared in England in the late 15th century, could sweep through a community with terrifying speed and lethality. Even something as simple as appendicitis or a burst ulcer would be a death sentence. Childbirth is a perilous event for both mother and child, with high rates of maternal mortality. Beyond illness, accidents are a constant danger. Working with sharp tools, handling livestock, navigating treacherous terrain, or simply living in a home with an open fire and flammable materials all carry inherent risks. A fall, a burn, a goring from an ox. These can lead to disabling injuries or death. And then there's the less predictable, but ever-present threat of violence. While your small village might be relatively peaceful most of the time, feuds between families, disputes over land or resources, or the arrival of bandits or marauding soldiers, especially during times of war or unrest, can shatter the peace and bring sudden death or devastation. Remember the lack of effective policing and the perils of the road? Those dangers don't magically disappear at your doorstep, especially if your door is a flimsy wooden construction. So, as you lie on your lumpy pallet, these anxieties, both general and specific, might churn in your mind. You listen for any unusual sounds outside, for any change in the breathing of your loved ones beside you. The boundary between sleep and wakefulness is thin, easily breached by worry. A quirky tidbit: deathbeds and last words. In a society where death is a frequent and visible visitor, the manner of one's dying and one's last words often take on great significance. A good death ideally involves being at peace with God, having received the last rites of the church, and being surrounded by family. People might prepare for death by making a will, if they have anything to bequeath, confessing their sins and forgiving their enemies. The last words uttered by a dying person are sometimes recorded or remembered, believed to hold special weight or insight. This concern with dying well reflects the deep religious convictions of the age and the focus on the fate of the soul in the afterlife. Historians still argue about the emotional landscape of medieval people in the face of such constant mortality. Did it lead to a certain fatalism, a stoic acceptance of loss as an inevitable part of life? Or did grief, when it struck, feel just as raw and devastating as it does today? Perhaps even more so given its frequency. The art, literature and religious practices of the period suggest a complex interplay of both acceptance and profound sorrow. The darkness before dawn often feels like the deepest, coldest part of the night. It's a time when vitality seems at its lowest ebb. You shift uncomfortably, your body stiff and sore from the previous day's labour and the unyielding bed. You long for the first hint of a light, the first sign that the night is finally releasing its grip. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, a change. A subtle lightening in the eastern sky, visible perhaps as a slightly less opaque grey through a crack in the wall. The sounds of the night begin to recede, replaced by the first tentative chirps of birds, the distant crow of a rooster heralding the new day. It is a moment of quiet relief, almost a small resurrection. You have made it through another night. Your family stirs beside you, groaning, coughing, slowly coming back to life. The simple fact of dawn breaking is a minor victory, a reprieve. The anxieties of the night might not vanish entirely, but they are pushed back by the promise of light and the familiar routines of the day ahead. For now, you have survived. Your 24 hours are almost complete, and the cycle is poised to begin anew, with all its attendant hardships and uncertainties. But for this brief moment, as the world reawakens, there is a sense of continuity, of life persisting against the odds. And so, as the very first, faint tendrils of dawn begin to pierce the oppressive darkness, our hypothetical journey through a medieval day draws towards its close. The relentless cycle of toil and tenuous survival is poised to begin anew, just as it has for countless generations before you in this imagined past. The chill in the air remains, a familiar companion, and the sounds of a waking world, both human and animal, slowly begin to swell, replacing the hushed anxieties of the night. You've navigated the muck and mire, endured the hunger and the hardship, witnessed the raw, unfiltered realities of an existence so far removed from our own. The scents, the sounds, the sheer, unyielding physicality of it all hopefully have painted a picture, however fleeting, of why those 24 hours would be such an extraordinary challenge for any of us accustomed to modern comforts. It wasn't just about surviving the big disasters. It was about surviving the everyday, the mundane, the relentlessly uncomfortable. As the light outside your small shuttered window grows a little stronger and the need to rise and face another day becomes undeniable, we will leave you there at the cusp of a new medieval morning. The pottage will soon be on the fire, the fields will be waiting, the town will stir with its familiar chaos. But for you, here and now, the demands of that world can fade. Let the images of that harsh, yet strangely resilient time soften and recede. Allow the discomforts and anxieties to dissolve, replaced by the quiet comfort of your own bed, the gentle hum of your own peaceful surroundings. The struggles of that distant past are just echoes now, whispers on the breeze of history. You're safe, you are comfortable, and a new day, your own day, awaits with its own, far gentler possibilities. Thank you for joining me on this little excursion into the past. I hope it's been a uniquely soothing experience. Until next time, may your own awakenings be soft and your days be filled with far more comfort than our medieval counterparts could ever have dreamed.